What's up, everybody? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And you see I got the glasses on again today, baby, so you know it's time to go in. Because today I'm bringing you a video on characterization and One Piece. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, characterization and One Piece. So I can sort of explain to you why I feel the way I feel about Oda and One Piece, and why I think that he's actually a mediocre writer. So let's get to it, baby. So first of all, I know I don't generally put out videos on the big three. I try to avoid it just so I could have a variety of topics on my channel so that I won't be focused on just the big three like a number of other people are in the YouTube anime community. But I will be addressing One Piece today, but only within the context of characterization. So most of this video will actually be about characterization, and then towards the end of the video, I'll sort of give you my thoughts on how One Piece stacks up with respect to characterization, and especially with regards to some of the other giants within the shonen genre, who I think are, at least as much as I've seen, who I think are the best in terms of characterization. So I'm just going to tell you this right now. If you haven't looked at the time on this video, I advise you to do so now. And if you're aware of the time, you know, put your seatbelts on, buckle yourself in, because you're in for a long-ass video. Also, I know a lot of, One Piece fans are going to be here. One Piece, I know, is insanely popular. I know a lot of my viewers are probably fans of that series. I'm also a fan of that series. But if you come on this video with ignorant-ass comments, I want you to know straight from jump that blocking season is in session. So your comments will be removed and blocked if you attack me in any way. If you disagree with me and you have intelligent reasons for doing so, or even if you disagree with me and you don't have intelligent reasons for doing so, I don't care. But if you attack me personally, your comment will be removed and you will be blocked. I'm telling you that right now. So this video is going to break into 5 parts. The first part is just, I'm going to give you some clarification on a couple of things. The second part is I'm going to give you the history of characterization, just sort of a brief literary history of characterization and why it's so important nowadays and why that always wasn't the case. The third part is going to be on what specifically characterization is. I'm going to try and clear up a lot of misconceptions about what characterization is and sort of break down what actually we mean by characterization, or at least what I mean by characterization. The fourth part is going to focus on characterization within One Piece, and specifically I'm going to be talking about Luffy and why I think that he's a flawed character and actually not, not a very good protagonist. And in the fifth part, I'm going to break down characterization with respect to other manga. So I'll be talking about, I believe, 6 other mangaka who I believe are people who I consider to be giants with respect to how good their characterization is. So now on to part 1, which is just some sort of clarification that I need to do as a preface to this video. A lot of you people seem to be confused about my criticism and my position towards One Piece. I criticize One Piece, and in fact, I criticize One Piece a lot, as you've heard in that Skype call I did on the Cloud Village, and that sort of discussion I had with King of Lightning. But I also want you people to understand one thing, and this is very important for you to understand. People can criticize something that they like. You make it seem as if I hate One Piece or if I just don't like One Piece, but I actually like One Piece. I actually enjoy One Piece. And I actually think out of the big 3, it's the best manga out of the big 3. Now, I don't think that, it's the best ongoing shonen series. I think that honor goes to Hunter x Hunter. But I actually do think One Piece is, pretty good. It's a very solid series. And I actually like it. I'm a fan of that series. And I've mentioned on previous occasions that I think the world building that Oda does within One Piece is on a god status level. Like, there's no one who does it better than Eiichiro Oda. And I also believe that the manga, even though I think it has some serious flaws, I think it has amazing potential for greatness, especially as we get in towards the New World, and especially as we get get to some heavier themes like the nature of justice and authority, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. To clarify another point, a lot of you people also seem to be confused about precisely what it is that a backstory does. A backstory in itself is not characterization. So if you come to me saying stuff like, well, you know, Nico Robin has a very complex backstory, or, you know, at least Luffy got a backstory. A backstory is not characterization. A backstory can be used to be the foundation of characterization that can take place. It can provide the context within which characterization occurs, but a backstory by itself is not characterization. If Oda decided to tell a backstory about Luffy that was just about him at a restaurant and eating a lot of food, that would be a sort of backstory, but it wouldn't be anything interesting in terms of providing us with details about Luffy's character, and it wouldn't have anything to do with characterization. In terms of characterization, that sort of backstory would be absolutely irrelevant. So a backstory in and of itself is not characterization, and that's something that a lot of people need to understand. Also, let me clarify my position on Oda as a writer. And I've said this, you know, multiple times in the past. Oda is a mediocre writer. He really is a mediocre writer. Now, I understand that a lot of One Piece fans may get offended by that. They may want to dash their head against the wall. They may want to jump out of a window. But that's just my personal opinion, and that's just how I feel. And I think I have very good reasons for believing that. Oda is a mediocre writer. Now, compared to a lot of other people like Kishimoto or any generic, you know, shonen series out there, I think he's above average compared to those mangaka. But if you're talking about the giants of the shonen genre, compared to them, he's not above average. He's mediocre, and I'll get to that later on as I talk about this, as I talk about characterization in this video. But the first 50 volumes of One Piece, which is all I've read, so I want you to understand that I'm not up to date, but I have read 50 volumes, and if you figure, you know, 50 volumes out of the 66, 67 that have been released, I've read a pretty good chunk of One Piece. If you just look at the concepts and themes of One Piece, the overriding theme and the overriding concept of the almost all of the first 50 volumes of One Piece is about Nakama, bonds, friendship. Very cliche stuff, very superficial stuff. I mean, if you want to look at another, you know, big three series, you know, Naruto, it's, you know, the same thing with this Nakama and this bonds. I mean, you know, One Piece doesn't drive it into the ground the way, you know, Naruto does, which is, you know, kind of bullshit now, especially with regards to how the Demon Fox is softening up. But anyway, that's basically the gist of the story. Now, with the exception of the Arlong stuff at the beginning, which raises issues of maybe, you know, slavery or discrimination, especially the tension that's going on between humans and the fishmen, and except for the stuff that begins to happen in CP9 with Nico Robin, and even that's about, you know, mostly about Nakama and friendship, although it begins to be about the nature of justice with Rob Lucci. The overriding themes of the first 50 volumes of One Piece almost exclusively about Nakama and friendship, which, like I said, is very cliche and, you know, very superficial as far as I'm concerned. It's not anything to run home about. Now, to me, the most interesting aspect of One Piece story-wise is the political factions that constitute the governing bodies of the One Piece world. That's where Oda's writing really shines, I think. When he starts to get into, you know, the world government and the pirates and the Yonko and the Shichibukai, and he starts to explore more concepts and themes like the nature of justice, the nature of authority, the nature of power, and the ethics of the world government and the pirates, and the sort of relationship between power and authority and justice. That's where Oda really starts to shine as a writer. Like when he introduces, you know, Rob Lucci with his notion of, you know, Yami no Seigi, which is, you know, dark justice, or, you know, excessive justice, or when he introduces Aga Inu, who has this notion of absolute justice. That's where, you know, Oda really starts to shine as a writer, because he's doing something that hasn't quite been done before. He's introducing a complex world wherein it's constituted by multiple governing factions that are vying for power, and forces the reader and the audience to reconsider or to consider new ways of thinking about justice and the relationship between justice, authority, and power. But besides that, the writing really, you know, isn't that good. And I really hope that Oda continues with these concepts and themes, and after the time skip, because to me, like I said, that's, you know, one of the most important and interesting aspects of the One Piece world and of Oda's writing. Now, when it comes to characterization, and I'll explain my reasons for this later on, Oda's subpar. I mean, he's just subpar. And like I said in my last, you know, the art of storytelling video, which I think is, you know, true. If the more characters you create, the harder it's going to be to give each character the time that they need in order to have good characterization. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. If you want to write a manga that's, you know, 40, 50, 60 volumes long, if you want to create a whole new world and populate it with, you know, dozens of characters, that's just the way it's going to be. And as a result of that, you know, his characterization is subpar. I think, and let me just be clear about this. There's a difference between being able to create character portraits and characterization. Character portraits is just the ability to give someone a very clear idea or a very clear sense of what somebody's personality is, and the ability to create interesting characters. Characterization is a little bit different from that, and it involves various aspects of character development. That's the difference between character portraits and characterization. And I think, you know, Oda excels at creating character portraits, but he's subpar at characterization. Now, let me clarify something else. I'm not trying to put rank on anybody here, you know, try and make it seem like, you know, I'm arrogant or I'm better than anybody else out there in the YouTube anime community, but I actually study literature. And I've been studying literature since, I mean, I was in my high school AP classes. And now that I'm in college, I've been studying literature for 5 years, and I've taken 4 graduate courses. 4 graduate courses. So when people write comments like, I'm confused, I tend to dismiss that as just, you know, them being ignorant of, you know, of my academic background. So to be more specific, I study African American literature, especially Black African American women writers. I've since then expanded my scope in the last, you know, couple of years to include literatures of the African diaspora, especially Caribbean literature and Francophone literature. My main areas of focus are post-structuralism, pragmatism, and the performativity of transnational Black subjectivity. So when you guys understand that, then you can tell me that I'm confused about literature. But until that time, I think you should cease with the ad hominem attacks. Now, let me clarify another point. People seem to be too invested in One Piece. And, you know, I understand that, you know, you like this series a lot, and, you know, maybe it had a very large impact on your life, but I think people are too invested in the One Piece manga. I mean, at this point, I honestly think that it's overrated, number one. And number two, it's ridiculously popular. I think in the last year, One Piece sold like 37 million volumes. And what happens when people get obsessed with a manga or basically any product that they consume is that they become extremely reluctant to admit that it has flaws, because it's just human nature for people not to want to have to admit that the thing that they like might not either, one, be that good, or two, that it might be good but have some serious flaws. So I think that you guys need to take a step back and be a little bit more objective in the way that you judge the One Piece manga. So now let me get to part 2 of this video, which is about sort of the literary history of characterization and how characterization developed within literature over, wow, the last 1,000 years. All right, so Aristotle, in a book that he wrote called Poetics, talked about how stories need to be plot driven. He argued for what he called plot driven narratives, and a plot driven narrative is a case where the main focus is on the story rather than on the characters. So the character tends to stand in as an allegory or an archetype. This basically means that a character does not represent him or herself. They represent an idea, a concept, or a class of people. Like I said, they're an allegory. However, this begins to change in the middle of the 19th century, especially around the 1850s, 60s, 70s, etc., with the advent of a new genre, a new narrative genre known as realism. And if you think about the history of the novel, there was a real concern with, you know, how to use literature or how to use narratives in order to get at truth or in order to tell the truth. Now, to a 21st century reader, this idea may seem, you know, absurd. Of course, we can use literature and narratives to, you know, tell the truth. But this was a real serious problem for early novelists, and it continued to be a problem even up until even till today with things like, you know, postmodern literature. But the early novelists in particular were obsessed with this idea of how to use literature and how to use novels to tell the truth. Now, realism emerged because the realist notion of truth, or the realist idea of how to use novels or to use fiction or narrative to tell the truth, was that literature was supposed to recreate life. It was supposed to duplicate reality. It was supposed to be a mirror of reality. And so they thought that literature had to represent reality. As a result, they shunned all fantastic literature because they said that, you know, it was useless. It can't tell you anything about reality if it doesn't find a way to actually mirror reality. So they emphasized strongly stories about real life. So the literature that they wrote was not very, you know, fantastic. It was very mundane, very down to earth. They emphasized very strongly things like narrative plausibility. But what absolutely revolutionized literature and novels was the idea of plausible characters. They were absolutely fascinated by the idea of, you know, characterization, and so there was a major shift in literature, at least as far as I know in the Western world, away from plot-driven narratives and towards character-driven narratives. And so basically, you know, what happened was that they became obsessed with this idea of psychology, of how the human mind worked. And so they wanted to create characters that would explore or show the vast variety of psychological dispositions that actual humans possessed. And so they were interested in ideas of how consciousness is formed and about how social conditions in particular led to the formation of consciousness at an individual level and of social consciousness on a more social level or a more communal level. So writers who, you know, are associated with the advent of realism are writers like, you know, Honoré de Balzac, Fyodor Dostoevsky, who wrote Crime and Punishment, I believe, Leo Tolstoy, and I'm sure you've probably heard a lot of these people, Gustave Flaubert, Jorge Luis Borges, William Dean Howells, who's an American who wrote The Hazard of New Fortunes and who was actually called the Dean of American Letters, who was really, really important in bringing realism to America, to the American literary scene. So that's how characterization came to be so important in novels, literature, and narratives. And so now let me move on to the third part of my video, which is about, you know, what is characterization? And I'm going to be getting a little bit technical in this portion of the video, but I don't believe it'll be, you know, that technical. I don't, you know, think it will be, you know, overly technical, I should say. So what is characterization? First, there has to be a distinction made between internal characterization versus external characterization. Internal characterization is about what happens within the character's mind. And this is where psychological complexity becomes very important for characterization. If any of you know, psychology is made up of two words that go back to the two Greek words, which are psyche, which means soul, and the ology part comes from the Greek logia, which means study of. So psychology literally means the study of the soul. And psychological complexity, or the psychology, deals with the foundation for acting. It allows you to establish why a character acts one way rather than another. It encompasses all of their motives, their desires, their purposes, and perhaps even their goals. Although, like J-Man expressed in a previous video, characters always need purpose, but they don't always need goals. Psychological complexity is very important for establishing emotional depth within characters, so that characters can display a range of emotions, so that they're not just tied into a very narrow sliver or a narrow spectrum of emotions. Internal characterization also deals with internal conflicts. So the conflicts that a character might have within themselves. So think about how, a character is influenced by doubt, or fear, or uncertainty, or anxiety. So that establishes some sort of tension within a character that allows us to see how they are psychologically complex, insofar as they tend to be just like us. They allow us to identify with that character by saying that they're a plausible character because they act, or they have a psychological mindset that's similar to how a human being would actually think, given the circumstances in which the characters may find themselves. Internal characterization is also very important in terms of ethical complexity. And I think ethical complexity might not be the right phrase. I think moral reflection might be a better phrase to sort of describe what I mean. But morality is about principles governing right or wrong. And it's also, so internal characterization deals with a character's ability to morally reflect, to engage in some moral reflection, so that they can ask questions like, how should I act in this situation? What should I do given the circumstances in which I find myself? And it allows characters to go through a process of moral decision making, which, establishes that they are a plausible character, because this is the sort of, decision making process that an actual human being would go through, and it allows the reader or the audience to identify with the character. And internal characterization also allows for, like I said before, a foundation for action. More specifically, it allows a character to not see the world in this sort of, duality. It's not black or white, but there are many shades of gray. And it encompasses a character's ability to properly understand the complexity of the situation in which they find themselves. And so internal characterization is primarily about, well, almost exclusively about introspection, consideration or evaluation of things that are within a character's mind. The flip side of that, like I've said, is external characterization. External characterization deals with the relationship between characters. So think about romantic interests, like the relationship between Kenshin Himura and Kamiya Kaoru in Rurouni Kenshin. Think about rivalries, like the rivalry between Naruto and Sasuke. And one of the most important relationships in all of shonen manga is the relationship between the protagonist and the antagonist. So external characterization is about how a character is influenced by relationships with other characters. And psychological complexity is also very important in terms of external characterization, because it shows that a character is plausible because they have the ability to navigate various social relationships. And external characterization is also important for shaping how, for showing how an environment shapes a character. So the external relationship, rather than being between characters, is now between a character and their environment or their particular social condition. And so it begins to you begin to see how psychological complexity is important, because it shows you how, you know, the environment is necessary for shaping or reshaping a character's psychological mind state. And you can see how this is true in things like, you know, apocalypse literature, where there's a major devastation, and a character has to now reorient themselves towards the situation in which they find themselves, sort of, you know, sort of try to account for this new environment or this new world in which they find themselves. Ethical complexity is also a very important component of external characterization, because it's about, because morality is all about, you know, relationships with other people. It's all about how should I act towards, you know, other people, and what do I owe other people as rational beings. And so ethical complexity is important because it shows how a character has the mental capacity to navigate, you know, complex situations and complex relationships with other characters. And it's also important for understanding, you know, how a character is plausible and whether or not they're realistic, because it allows the reader or the audience to see how a character can account for new circumstances. And so, you know, that's another important aspect of ethical complexity or moral reflection. And so external characterization is all about, you know, extrospection. Extrospection is the evaluation or consideration of things that are external to one's mind, that is external to oneself. So if you have too much introspection, there has to be some balance, because if you have too much introspection, then you can neglect other characters, you can neglect, you know, the environment or the outside world. But on the other hand, if you have too much extrospection, then you can neglect, you know, the sort of inner workings of the mind of your characters, and in particular, this will lead you to neglect your protagonist, which, you know, the protagonist is a very important character within the shonen genre. So now let me talk about, you know, another component of characterization, which is indirect versus direct characterization. Now, indirect characterization happens when a reader or the audience has to infer what a character is like. Inference is the ability to draw conclusions based on evidence and reasoning. So there's three things about indirect characterization. The first is manner of speech, which is how a person talks. So it's mainly concerned with dialogue, and dialogue in two senses. The first sense is external dialogue, so dialogue between various characters, but also internal dialogue, so the dialogue that a character has within themselves, their ability to reflect within themselves. So manner of speech is about drawing inferences from dialogue. So what kind of personality does this character have? What kind of, you know, person is this character based on how they speak? The second component of indirect characterization is manner of behavior. So how, you know, a character acts both by themselves and how they act with other people and around other people. So how do other people respond to their behavior, and how do characters, you know, act when they're around this other character, or rather this particular character. Manner of behavior allows you to draw inferences about a character's, you know, personality based on how they act. And so if this is done well, then the reader or the audience will be able to interpret the character as a real person. They will see them as a real person who has, you know, particular manners of speech and who act in, you know, particular ways. And so that will help the audience or the reader gather some information so that they can determine what type of character, what type of person this character is. But if it isn't done well, then the audience or the reader won't see this as a realistic character, and they won't see them as a plausible character, and that may actually create some problems for storyline, because it may create some plot inconsistencies. But I won't, you know, touch on that. Now, the final component of indirect characterization is something called physiognomy, which is, you know, pretty outdated by this time. Although there are still some authors who use this, but in very subtle ways. Physiognomy is the belief or the idea that you can tell what a character's personality is like based off of their appearance, just based solely on their appearance. So, you know, if, you know, it used to be like, you know, if a person's nose was, you know, wide or thin, they would have, you know, a particular personality. If their hands were big, then, you know, you could tell what type of person they would be. So things like that. But you can, you know, see how, you know, that really doesn't make any sense now that we know that that's not true. Although there is some research that's starting to be developed, which suggests that there is some correlation between certain facial features and certain personality traits. Like, you know, people with, you know, wider faces there is a correlation between people with wider faces and aggression, because there's this idea that, you know, testosterone causes, you know, male faces to be, you know, larger. So the more testosterone you have, the larger your face will be, and thus, you know, testosterone also regulates aggression levels. So there might be some correlation between, you know, certain facial features and personality traits, but I won't delve into that too much. The second component is direct characterization, as opposed to indirect characterization. Now, direct characterization is when the reader or the audience is directly told what a character is like. So someone tells you what the character is like. So either the narrator tells you what the character is like, you know, other characters can say something like, you know, so-and-so is mean. So you're directly told what their personality is like by other characters, or the character, him or herself, can reveal something about themselves. They can say, you know, I love this person. So you can, you know, make certain, you know, assumptions about, you know, what the character has told you that they're like. Although, well, I won't get into that. That raises too many questions. I just had a thought in my head and I was going to explain it, but then I was like, never mind. So let me just address right quick the role of the narrative voice, or the non-existence of the narrator in manga. Manga is a very interesting medium because the narrator is very limited or non-existent. Now, there are some instances where you get like a narrator, like at the end of the chapter, the narrator will say something like, there'll be written something like, you know, now that Naruto has been challenged by pain, what will happen in the next chapter? So there'll be something like that. But that's a very, very, very limited use of the narrative voice. Narrators or narration breaks down into three parts. There's the first person narrative, which uses things like I did this, I did that, I think this. That's narration in the first person. Narration in the second person, which is extremely rare, is when a writer uses you. So you did this. You woke up yesterday morning. You got up. You brushed your teeth. That's, you know, narration in the second person. Narration in the third person is like he, she, it. So Naruto got up. You know, he brushed his teeth. He combed his hair. Things like that. So that's narration in the third person. But manga is very interesting because it doesn't have tense and it doesn't have perspective, meaning that it happens in a perpetual noun. We experience events as they happen in a presumably, you know, present state. So there is no past tense, there is no future tense, there isn't really even a present tense because there's no narration. It's just, you know, events unfold in a perpetual now, in a sort of perpetual present. So there's no tense and no perspective when it comes to manga. And third person narrative tends to be the most commonly used in narrative mediums outside of, you know, manga. So in almost all narratives, third person is used. Second person almost never. First person sometimes, but that's a small minority. So it's almost always the third person. Now, in third person narration, there's two components. The first is objective. The second is subjective. I'll just focus on subjective. Subjective third person happens when the narrator clues in the reader or the audience on the internal thoughts. Well, all thoughts are internal. Maybe. That's a philosophical question that I won't get into right now. But third person subjective happens when the narrator lets you in on the inner thoughts, the thoughts of the characters. And I know this may seem like I'm going completely off track with this, but there is definitely a very important connection that I want to make between narration, or the lack of narration in manga, and characterization. So that's what subjective third person is. However, this isn't available in manga because there's no narrator. So the narrator can't tell us what a character is thinking, or what their thoughts are, what their motives are, what their desires are. So what happens is a character's ability to reflect becomes extremely important, because the only way that we can get at what's going on inside of a character's head is if they tell us, or if they're thought bubbles, because there's no narrator, there's no narration. So this is extremely important for characterization. So if you have a character who rarely or never engages in any sort of, reflection on their actions, then their internal characterization is practically going to be non-existent. And I'll talk about this a little bit later on, but that is extremely problematic for a character. I mean, that is pretty bad characterization in my book. And like I said, I'll explain this a little bit more. I'm looking at my notes right now, so now, this is important in terms of both psychological and ethical complexity. And this is important because if you want to understand the psychology of a character, if you want to understand their mindset or their mind frame, then there has to be some point at which a character is able to reflect with their thoughts, reflect on their action, reflect on their relationships with their environment, reflect on their relationships with other characters. But if they don't have any sort of, ability to reflect on their thoughts, or reflect on, any of these various aspects of the story, then they won't have any internal characterization. And so what happens is they become extremely psychologically shallow. They don't have any psychological complexity. They don't have ethical complexity. And they basically seem like dunces. They basically become idiots. Just retards, basically. Which sadly is what happens to Luffy. And I'll get to that a little bit later on. So now, another important component of characterization is character development. Now, character development encompasses the evolution of a character. So how does a character change throughout the story? Are they the same as they were, are they the same now as they were when the story first started, even though they've been through all these challenges or all these obstacles, etc.? So character development encompasses, the challenges and the obstacles that a character goes through, and how they respond to those obstacles and challenges. And so it allows the reader or the audience to see how they have grown. And so it allows the character to establish new levels of understanding, so that they grow in some psychological sense. You see some development also in an ethical sense, so that their growth is not just restricted to things like, power-ups, which is, just horrible. If you have a character and the only way they've grown is in strength, then as a mangaka, or even as a writer, you're fucking up big time. You're just messing up big time. An interesting part of character development, which a lot of people don't really understand, or what they have, or that they haven't considered, is that it's possible to have character development as progress, but it's also possible to have character development as regress. So rather than grow, a character can actually regress. And this typically happens when a character sort of descends into darkness. They start off as very promising, but later on they descend into darkness. And this happens in the case of, Anakin Skywalker, who later on becomes Darth Vader. And this typically happens when someone becomes psychologically or mentally unstable, and so their ability to engage in complex reflection sort of diminishes, and they start to see the world in only black and white, only right and wrong, which is basically what happens to Anakin Skywalker, who from a clinical standpoint suffers from something called borderline personality disorder. This also happens in cases of trauma, where a character may be just absolutely incapable of coping with their situation. So this happens to somebody like Casca in Berserk, or like Kenshin in Rurouni Kenshin, who goes through an extremely traumatic event in the Jinshu arc, which is the third arc of Rurouni Kenshin. Also, along with, character development, another part of character development is character consistency. So, does a character have continuity between their past actions and their present actions? Or if the situation has changed, do they have the ability to sort of fit this new circumstances into their world view so that they can sort of act appropriately? In psychological and ethical complexity, again, is a major component of character consistency, because it establishes characters as realistic if their thoughts correspond to their actions, if they actually do what they say that they believe. And character consistency is important, but it's also important not to take it too far. Like, characters shouldn't be overly predictable. Of course, as you grow with a character, you start making certain assumptions about how a character will act in this situation, but they shouldn't be overly predictable. They shouldn't act exactly the same way, no matter what the situation or no matter what the circumstance is. So let me just make a very important distinction before I move on to the part 4, which is my discussion of One Piece and Luffy in particular. Internal and external characterization is about how psychological or ethical complexity is created within a character. That's what internal and external characterization is about. Indirect and direct characterization is about how psychological and ethical complexity gets displayed by a character. So those are, two very important distinctions that you have to keep in mind when you're thinking about internal and external characterization versus direct and indirect characterization. So now let me get to my discussion of One Piece. And remember, I'm not caught up. So I just want you to, take this, with a grain of salt. I'm not concerned with anything that happens after the first 50 volumes because I haven't read it, and so I can't remark on it. So let me just discuss, the first 50 volumes of One Piece, and in particular, Luffy. Now, right off the bat, Luffy has no internal characterization. None. He has no psychological complexity. He has no ethical complexity. None whatsoever. He has no introspection. He has no internal dialogue. I mean, it's like he has no ability to reflect on his actions, or to reflect on the situation, or to reflect on even himself. At least that's true within the first 50 volumes of the manga. Now, if you're a writer and you're a mangaka and you write 50 volumes, which God knows how many pages that is, and you have a protagonist who's the linchpin of your story, but they have an inability to engage in any sort of reasoning or any sort of reflection, and they don't have the ability to display any sort of psychological or ethical complexity, that is an absolute problem for your story. And I'm going to explain how this is a problem, particularly for Luffy. And there's two things that really irk me about Luffy's character that is just, you know, very bad writing. The first is that Luffy is always on the morally right side of the conflict. Now, I've just said that Luffy never engages in any sort of moral reflection. If you look at Luffy throughout the story, all of the conflicts that he's engaged in are never because he thinks that it's the right thing to do to engage in these conflicts. It's always because he just happens to make friends with people who are on the morally right side of the conflict. Don't you think that's odd? I mean, don't you think that's a little bit weird that a person who never engages in moral reflection just happens to always make friends with people who are on the morally right side of the conflict? That's bad writing. That's bad characterization, and it's bad writing. I mean, it's god-awful because it allows you, and this is the second thing that I really dislike about Luffy's character, is that it's based on this Nakama bullshit, which, like I said, is very superficial and it's very cliche. Like, it's a silly way for Oda to have Luffy get involved in all of these conflicts. Like, he only gets involved in conflicts where his Nakama are concerned. So what does Oda do? Oda makes it the case that in order for Luffy to get into conflicts, he just happens to make friends really quickly. I mean, that's just silly. That's a silly way to involve your protagonist in conflicts. And think about this, and this is very important, and this will be very important for the remainder of the story. Like, Luffy doesn't give a shit about the world government. He doesn't care about whether or not the world government is moral or whether or not the world government is just or ethical. The only reason why he's involved with the world government is because they hurt his friends. If they never hurt his friends, Luffy wouldn't give a shit about the world government. He wouldn't care if they enslaved people, if they raped people, if they committed genocide. He wouldn't give a shit. You know why? Because he has no moral reflection, no ethical complexity, no psychological complexity, basically no internal characterization. That's horrible. That's bad writing. I mean, those are two very specific ways that the story of One Piece is compromised by Luffy's bad characterization. That's just bad writing on Oda's part. Another thing that I don't like about Luffy is that he's highly predictable. Like I said, he's a cliche. Extremely stereotypical, extremely superficial. He basically fills in the role of the strong idiot, which is, you know, kind of a Goku ripoff, but, you know, Goku was at least smarter than Luffy. I mean, he wasn't a freaking idiot. Then the final thing. Oh, wait, let me get into this. There's nothing interesting about Luffy. Nothing. There's nothing revolutionary about Luffy. He doesn't bring anything new to the shonen genre, and he doesn't bring anything new to the character of the protagonist. Absolutely nothing. The final thing is that Luffy never has a backstory. If you go through 50 volumes of writing, constantly engaging your protagonist in multiple conflicts between various political factions in your world, and your character doesn't have a backstory, you know what this means, ladies and gentlemen? That's the sign for bad. That's bad writing. Like, your characters need some sort of backstory in order to establish a psychological foundation for their personality in the present. That's what backstories do. Backstories aren't characterization, but they allow for internal characterization. They provide a context for internal characterization. But if your character doesn't have any internal characterization to begin with, backstories are pretty much irrelevant. So now let me address something that, you know, some people said on my phone video that I did. Master King JC made, I think, a good point, which is that, you know, you don't need complex characters for a good story. But let me respond in this way. I like to make this distinction, and I've been making this distinction since the very beginning. And this distinction is this. There is a difference between whether or not a story is enjoyable and whether or not a story has quality. Those are two distinct things, two separate things. Now, you can have an enjoyable story without complex characters. Think Fairy Tail. Fairy Tail is pretty much shit. But it's enjoyable, it's entertaining, no complex characters. But if you want to write a quality story, you can't write a quality story without good characters. You can't. It's not possible. And here's why. You can't have a story without conflict. That's just writing 101. If you don't have conflict, you don't have a story. If there's no conflict, there's no reason to keep reading. There's two types of conflict. There's internal conflict, there's external conflict. Internal conflict is about the conflict within the character's mind. External conflict is about the conflict between either a character and his environment or between various characters. So external to oneself. Now, manga focuses on both of these, but the main focus is on external conflict, i.e. fights. Fights are, a very important component of the shonen genre. But the best fights, to me, have some sort of ideological component. It can't just be, two people mindlessly engaging in a fight. There actually have to be good reasons for a fight to take place, and that fight has to serve as a backdrop or a foundation for other important ideological conflicts within the story. Otherwise, you get things like cannon fodder, or you get things like just mindless violence, which, is just retarded. Mindless violence is fail. However, you can't have good conflict without good characters. If you have one-dimensional characters, then that will automatically limit the sort of themes and concepts that you can explore. Why? Because your character won't have the ability to account for the complexity of various situations. They won't be able to comprehend the complexity of the various situations. So imagine if Kenshin Himura from Rurouni Kenshin was like Luffy. Imagine if Kenshin Himura was an idiot. Oh, God. I don't even think it's possible to write Rurouni Kenshin if Kenshin Himura was an idiot. Because the whole conflict between Makoto Shishio and Kenshin Himura, I'm not going to, spoil anything too much. But the whole conflict was about nationalism. It was a conflict about Japanese nationalism. But if you have a character who can't reflect on what it means for Japan to become a nation and to establish a bureaucratic form of government, then it takes all of the impetus and all of the important themes and concepts right out of the story. They become irrelevant because your character can't understand them. And also think about a story like Imasoko ni Ruboku, which someone else brought up. The character of Shuzo Matsutani. They wanted to say that, now and then, here and there was a good story, even though Shuzo Matsutani was, basically an idiot. Imasoko ni Ruboku was okay, but it could have been better. And here's why. Because Shuzo Matsutani was a freaking idiot. He had no ethical complexity. And I'm going to spoil something for people. So if you don't want to be spoiled about Imasoko ni Ruboku or now and then, here and there, skip like 30 seconds into the video. But there's something that happens where a girl gets raped and gets impregnated by her rapist. Shuzo Matsutani's response is, You shouldn't kill yourself. You shouldn't be depressed because life is always good and it will always get better and eventually if you just keep living, something so unbelievably good will happen to you that it will absolutely outweigh all the bad things that have happened to you. I mean, now, do I really need to explain why that's retarded? I mean, could you imagine if the police officer who was investigating, like if you were a woman and you were raped, and the police officer who was investigating your rape said to you, well, you shouldn't be depressed because eventually you'll get over it. And something so good will happen to you that it will just outweigh the fact that you've been raped. Really? If you think that's a good story, you think Imasoko ni Ruboku was a good story with a protagonist like that? Really? Seriously? If you think that's a good story, then I would suggest that your standards for good storytelling have to be like way, way, way in the basement. Really in the basement. So also somebody else mentioned this, that psychological and ethical complexity is not the only thing that makes good characters. That's true. However, without psychological and ethical complexity, you can't have a good character. I'm not even sure. I don't even think you can have a good story. Without those two things, you can't have a good story, and you certainly won't have a good character. Those may not be, they may not be the only thing that determines whether or not you have good characters, but they're certainly so important that without them, you can't possibly have good characters. So, I know I said there's gonna be a part 5 to this video, but I'm already like at an hour. I actually might have to break this up into 2 parts. I really don't want to do that, but I think I'm going to have to. But let me just, do part 5 and then see what I want to do after I record this video. Jesus, this is already 55 minutes long. The mangaka who I consider to be giants in the shonen genre, and giants in the manga medium when it comes to characterization, is one, and this is in no particular order, but Watsuki Nobuhiro, definitely, for the work that he did in Rurouni Kenshin. If you haven't checked out my review of the manga series Rurouni Kenshin, you can, go check that out. For the work that he did on Kenshin Himura, the work that he did with Aoshi Shinomori, Makoto Shishio, Yukishiro Inishi, and even the side characters like Sanosuke Sagara, Yahiko Myojin, Kamiya Kaoru. Amazing work. Also, Kentaro Miura, who's a seinen mangaka, who's the mangaka of Berserk, which I'll probably have a review out, but I'm not sure when, but I'll probably review it. The work that he has done with Guts is just absolutely amazing. And somebody said to me that Nico Robin has a complex backstory. No. Guts from Berserk has a complex backstory. His backstory is 10 or 11 volumes long. I mean, it's so complex that there's characterization within his backstory. There's characterization within his backstory. Now that's a complex backstory. Also, for the work that he's done with Griffith, just amazing psychological complexity in terms of Griffith and his descent into darkness. Just amazing work. Also, Hiroyuki Takei for the work that he did in Shaman King. And even if you haven't read Shaman King, just go read the one-shot manga Shaman King Zero, an untold story of Yo Asakura. And if you haven't, seen my review of that one-shot, check out my review of Shaman King Zero. I think it's actually the featured video on, if you go to my channel page. Amazing work that he did with Yo Asakura. Amazing work, even in Shaman King, the original Shaman King manga that he did with the relationship between Yo and Hao, and Choco Love, and also Ren. I mean, amazing work that Hiroyuki Takei did with those characters. Also, Togashi Yoshihiro, who's most famous for his work, probably his work of Yu Yu Hakusho, although Hunter x Hunter is also insanely popular in Japan. The moral evolution of the villain Meruem. I mean, I've never seen the evolution, the moral evolution of a villain, the way Yoshihiro Togashi writes out the character of Meruem. Amazing work. Amazing work with Gon as well. Now, Gon is, somewhat of an idiot, but he can get very serious very fast. I mean, he can get very serious very fast, and that's something I like about Gon. He has that, that sort of, childish element to him, but he also, can become, very serious. Also, the work that he's done with Killua, which was just amazing characterization with Killua and the relationship that Killua had to his family. And also the amazing work that he's done, with Kurapika and sort of Kurapika's, struggle with the Phantom Troop. Also, another mangaka who I consider to be a sort of, giant. Naoki Urasawa for his work in Monster. His ability to create, you know, a sort of a very engaging, compelling, realistic psychological profile of Johann Liebert, who's a sort of psychopathic serial killer. Although he's not a sociopath. He's not a sociopath, which is very, very interesting. He's a psychopath, but not a sociopath. I mean, just amazing characterization that he's done with Johann Liebert, and also Johann Liebert's sister, and also the protagonist of the series, Kenzo Tenma. Amazing work that he's done with those characters. And also Yoshiyuki Tomino for his work in Gundam. And not just the original Mobile Suit Gundam, but Mobile Suit Gundam, Zeta Gundam, and Double Zeta Gundam. For the evolution of Char Aznavour as a character who I've mentioned previously. His evolution as, you know, from an antagonist to a protagonist to a justifiable villain, just very good work. And also his work in Zeta Gundam with the protagonist of Camille B. Don created a very compelling, very interesting, very complete psychological profile of Camille B. Don, who had both psychological complexity and ethical complexity. So if you've stuck around this long, I sincerely thank you for watching the entirety of this video. And this is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga. Just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace and have a blessed day.